Recent days have seen great turmoil in not only the United States, but the world, and not only in people's personal lives and the health aspect of people's lives, but also economically and financially. This past week has seen extraordinary and unprecedented moves in the oil market. And many other things have been happening economically and financially. The president has made various announcements from the podium on different nights during the press conferences. And people who are following and trying to understand what's happening are finding that very difficult. It's a lot of things are again, unprecedented, have never been seen before, and therefore difficult to contextualize. But with us, of course, is the master of context, Don, and he is going to discuss some of his perspective on what has been happening in the financial markets recently.
Okay, a little bit of background is, and one of the things that we try to do here, of course, is to look at current events and perspective and history and everything from a psychological perspective. So, with the idea of money in the forefront here and economics in general and the turmoil that we're in, we begin to see psychological aspects about money. And with the supply chains being talked about in the news and the goods and services not moving as they had before, we see that really we've come to an abrupt halt in a lot of the movement of our currency. The current is no longer flowing. So what does that do for the confidence that people have in the economy? Well, it begins to take a nosedive. And I can't help but think, well, was this expected? Because President Trump has made a major point of making the United States economy look absolutely stellar up until the whole coronavirus shutdown of the economy. And what does that look like now? Well, to me, and I'll give you a little bit more background, it looks like he's been preparing for something to be switched on and then switched off and then switched on again. And I really don't think this is all an accident. I think that this has been planned, and we are going to be seeing the unveiling of something new. And as Dave of X22 says, it's going to be a bumpy ride because there's no way that you can make it smooth with all the uncharted territory that lies ahead. But I do believe that President Trump has been recruited for this position by some patriot military that were going to leverage his understanding of bankruptcy and the ability to transition assets from out of bankruptcy and move them forward into whatever happens after bankruptcy. But before I get into that, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. The first thing I want to do is talk about the world reserve currency and put that into a historical context. And the first chart I'm looking at is where you see different nations over different periods of time, sometimes as long as a couple hundred years, it usually not much more than 100 years. You have different nations serving as the world reserve currency. And when we see things like this happening in the world, we think, oh, well, that's just natural. That's just the way it is. You have to have a world reserve currency. Who's next? And what do we want to do different from the one that went before? Well, let's step back even further from that and think about that. Why would there be a world reserve currency? If you look back on the histories of these nations, in one way or the other, these different nations that came before the United States was Britain, before Britain was France, before that was the Netherlands. They were all about whichever empire was expanding the most. And whenever you are in expansion mode, you have power, number one. You have a military power, something of force to back it up. And then you are the dominant force in commerce. And then, so you control the currency because you say, well, we can pay you this, and people want it because they want what you have, and you also because you have a strong army and you're going to invade them if they don't buy what you tell them that they want. Anyway, that's the game as it's been played over history. So we see that there is a succession of this, but we may be in for something different this time, because the United States was basically a developing nation at the time that it became the world reserve currency, right before World War II, and then after, when we really fully developed from a fledgling economy into a powerhouse economy. But that transition is nearly done, and there are no other nations. Now, I believe and seen evidence over a long period of time that there was a plan to place China in that position for China to become the world reserve currency, but do it in a slightly different way. And I believe that President Trump did know about that, but that he did not basically want to have a communist nation. And it wasn't only President Trump that didn't want this. He didn't want a world reserve currency to be run or managed by a consortium that wasn't responsible to the people. So that's the quandary that we're in right now. And it's going to be, as I said, bumpy road as this gets sorted out. But I do believe that there are people that have been working out the details. And we are not being told about them for good reasons. That is really the elephant in the room. It's, why don't we know what's happening? Well, the obvious answer is because the people that are running the show don't want the common everyday folks, you and me, to know what's happening. And there really is no more powerful means of control than money or finance. It determines what people do. And if you are the power brokers and you have been overseeing the global economy, you're a part of the super elite that get to decide the fate of humanity. Are you going to tell your average Joe six-pack what's coming next? No, you're going to have it all wrapped and ready to go, and then it's going to unfold when it happens. But yet we have a struggle about that unfolding. And that struggle, as we have been discussing somewhat in previous broadcasts, has to do with the collapse of the petrodollar, which has gone from $60, $40 range down into negative territory. And this is really, really surprising to a lot of people. And I have to say, I think it's dramatic for a reason. It's to make people sit up and take notice that we've got to we've got to do something about the global economy. It's a mess. Well, the petrodollar was the way that the United States kept the economy going after the end of World War II and in the transition away from a gold standard in 1970. From 1970 on, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, we basically, with financial agreements with the Arab oil countries, such as Saudi Arabia, the oil-producing companies needed to buy their currency in dollars. That enabled the United States to keep on expanding its economy, keep on printing money, and have a ready market for that currency. The currency was actually had to be held by any oil-producing nation to be able to receive payment for their oil in dollars. And those agreements were set up worldwide. So that actually gives us a clue. When we see the price of oil going negative, what does that cry out? It tells you something's rigged, something's off kilter, because there really aren't people that are paying money that are saying, please take this oil off our hands and we'll pay you to do it. That isn't really happening. It tells you that there are contracts that are saying that that's supposed to happen and things are priced that way, but that's not reality. So basically what we have here is a reality check, because although there is the possibility of new so-called free energy sources on the horizon that President Trump has hinted about that will be, I believe, unveiled within the next decade or two, that isn't here yet. So we have no real good solid reason for oil going negative. I think it has to do with the contracts that have controlled the price of oil going into uncharted territory and basically the whole system going wonky. But it does make people ask the question, what are we going to do? What's next with the global economy? And you no longer have this confidence game that's working. The confidence has left the dollar in the dust. There is no more confidence in this, the movement of the economy, as long as the price of oil collapses. Now, will it start back up again? I think we are going to see a bit of a bounce, but probably you could call it a dead cat bounce. It will not be a full recovery. We will move into something new. And President Trump has hinted in the past very strongly that he wants to return to something like a gold standard. And we have seen that there have been a Q post that says that the United States does have the gold, which means that it's been recovered, or, whatever was in Fort Knox that people said isn't there anymore is actually back there again, or something along those lines. There have been, over the last couple decades, nations that have been acquiring gold on a very, very large scale. And the United States has covertly been one of them. And again, this is all happening basically very quietly. This is not in the news because you're not supposed to know about it, but there have been people that have said, well, yeah, gold's got to go back up in price, and they've sunk their money into buying physical gold, and may actually, I think, probably be disappointed when it doesn't have this meteor-like rise that some people are expecting. I think this is all very, very much controlled, and it has been worked out, and people, in order for the stability of the global markets and the interaction of nations to be maintained, it can't be too rocky of a road. It can't be that you have this all of a sudden a huge spike in the gold price. I believe it is going to be managed and is going to go up slowly. Because it has been kept down artificially, it will go up. But to what level remains to be seen.
When you're discussing the petrodollar, it has been, if I'm not wrong, the Federal Reserve that has controlled the petrodollar. And one very interesting thing that the president has said recently from the podium in one of the press conferences was that the Federal Reserve is being brought under the Treasury Department. And that is a completely new expression of finance in this country, isn't it?
Right. Yes, he did say that. It's our money now, and we can print as much of it as he wants. Now, so what does that tell you? President Trump is claiming ownership of the confidence game of money. And this is something that Americans have actually believed that was true, that hasn't been true. And President Trump, by stating it in the way that he has actually said, we have taken back our money supply. Now, you're kind of going in the back door someplace, something that I forgot to mention earlier, which is that before the petrodollar, the United States dollar, as of FDR's New Deal, was actually, and still is, even though it's additionally underpinned by the oil exporting, it's the dollar since the FDR's New Deal is backed by United States citizens who are surety for the debt. And that is not well known because, and most people, many people, fewer than before, would say that it's a crazy conspiracy to think that you're a bonded surety for the debt of the dollar. But if you actually look into it, you'll find out that it is, in fact, true. And the FDR's New Deal was actually bankruptcy reorganization. The Federal Reserve took charge of the money printing in the United States in 1913, and within the space of, well, less than 20 years, the United States was bankrupt by design. That was their plan, and the Great Depression was engineered. Many people, like Charles Lindbergh's father, said so at the time, and they didn't want the word to get out, so it didn't get out because the newspapers and media at that time were controlled. But you have, ever since 1933, the dollar has actually been supported by the bonds that have been for sale at private levels by very wealthy institutions and individuals on a private international market. And that has been the funding of the dollar. It hasn't been, as many people say, a fiat dollar backed by nothing. It's actually been backed by the U.S. labor pool, and there are bonds on the birth certificates. I've got an example of that, and that's around. But that's the system that, as Americans found out about it, they said, this has got to be wrong. We've got to do away with this. And President Trump is actually telling us we are actually doing away with this. We don't have a private Federal Reserve anymore. It's now our money. It's being absorbed into the Treasury. And yes, the United States, that of which President Trump is president, is a corporation, but it isn't an external corporation. It's a corporation that is run by those that are elected. Anyway, the system is changing, and the fact that it's our money now means that something is going to have to be changed as far as what underpins the value of the dollar. We don't know exactly what that is. It wasn't nothing before. It was actually the United States labor pool, and it's going to go to something. And we're in that change period, and I believe that President Trump has been brought into the presidency in order to manage that change out of bankruptcy reorganization that we've been in since 1933. So we shall see how it all shakes out. It's very exciting times to live in. And I know Ken's been sitting there quietly, and he's probably going, oh boy, this is a crazy conspiracy. I hate to be associated with this group. You guys are a bunch of wackos.
Well, actually, I think the move negative, when you see the supporting commodity go into that range, it's kind of like watching a Biden speech. You know, it just he may recover, tomorrow he may be okay, but it just seems like, wow, this, the confidence kind of goes out. So I'd call it a watershed event for me personally, just looking at it. And Don, you mentioned going to something for backing that commodity. It might be gold, but I just wanted to ask, could it be slavery? And what I mean by that is, if we go into a permanent condition of borrowing from the future, does that not look like slavery? I'm not sure. Also, I know they do this to Trump, but I'll ask you, I'm going to tag on to that another question. And if a succeeding administration comes on board, was that absorption of the Fed into the Treasury beneficial? Let's say Bernie Sanders won, just hypothetically. So with that context, I am kind of concerned. The oil standard was probably not the best thing in the world, but if the gold standard move fails, I don't see any other possibility. But we can comment on that if you would like.
Nothing is guaranteed, that's for sure. And I do hear what you're saying, especially if we get a radical shift to socialism, and we've seen obviously Venezuela as a prime recent example, that if you just have in your mind, the leaders do, the idea that we can print money because it's ours, and President Trump is almost asking for this, saying, well, yeah, we can print as much as we want because we own it now. Well, we know that that leads to runaway hyperinflation, which is obviously bad for everybody, and your dollars become worthless. And that's the very kind of thing that would happen if we had a socialist crew come into power. Now, this is, I would have to say, kind of I'd have to mark it on the plus side for the deep state. They don't really want that. They don't want Bernie Sanders to get in power because the power elite, what we call the deep state, they have power because they have the inside track on this corrupt money system, and it has been corrupted. There's been those that won't expose the evil deeds are the ones that get paid off so that they don't. And that's what's kept the deep state active. Well, if the dollar becomes worthless because a socialist gets in power and starts printing money wildly to do good things for the people, then the dollar becomes very, very unvaluable. And those that have been in mostly the Democrat Party, but also many Republicans, their holdings, whether there be real estate or stocks or anything else, the value is going to plummet. They don't want that. So we are at a dangerous crossroads. Fortunately, I would have to say fortunately, oddly enough, the Democrat Party did not let Bernie Sanders get into power. So we're not going to see it unfold that way. Now, as far as borrowing from the future, I sure hope it doesn't go that way too. I do believe that there's going to have to be some contracts written for some kind of a transition period, which I think we'll be in for a while. And the example that Dave of X22 always gives is the transition away from the partially gold-backed dollar to the petrodollar in the early 1970s, and that being a bumpy road. And this is going to be something similar. I think probably even more so, even rockier, because we at the grassroots level don't know what it's going to look like. I do believe there is a plan. I do believe that various nations that are economically powerful have been brought in with their leaders. I believe that that's what President Trump has been doing with his so-called trade negotiations. I believe they've really been ultimately about securing the value of the dollar into the future by means of contracts to buy and sell goods and services between other nations. And the more of these individual, not centrally managed, but bilateral contracts that the United States has with other nations, the more tied to each other we are in a good way. So we stabilize one another if we build a future together where the United States manufactures things so it can sell things overseas, and that's why we have to get our manufacturing power back. We can no longer just export our inflation and let that be our product. That has been what the United States has been exporting. It's been exporting dollars. That's how the petrodollar has worked. Well, that confidence game has ended, and it's now time to move into the next stage.
You know, it's how you painted it. It was interesting. So it looks like a kind of a triangular triangular firing squad, kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The scene there, it's an iconic scene. But so we have the Trump movement, or let's call it the populism movement. It's almost a worldwide phenomenon. And then we also have the deep state, which is also a worldwide phenomenon. Trans-European, EU, the U.S. deep state, the conventional amorphous body that we've pretty much have acknowledged it does exist finally. And then you've got the sort of the worldwide socialism movement that would be represented by the Bernie crew. But I guess in this standoff, you have to have the whole point of that scene in the movie was that 2 against 1 has to be the formula when there's a triangular situation. And I don't know. I guess this is why I think the Bernie candidacy would have been better. I'm not saying that, I personally would not want Bernie running, being the president, but it would have shut out it would have accomplished 2 things. The deep state would have been kind of set off to the side, and culturally we would have had a debate more about populism and socialism, and then arrived at, hopefully people realize that freedom is more important than debt slavery. And the gold standard would predominate, I think, in that case. But Don, let me ask you a question. There was a Fed, was it a Fed chairman, or was it one of the bank members? There was a woman who had expressed positive attitudes about the gold standard previously. And I don't know if that appointment is being held up, by Congress or what.
Yeah, Judy Shelton, I think, is the person that you're thinking of, and I almost threw a picture of her in there with the whole idea of President Trump promoting the gold standard, and many people believe that Judy Shelton is going to be championing the restructuring of the Federal Reserve dollar around a gold standard, and she has the nuts and bolts, the machinery under the hood to know how to do that. And she was previously, I think, on a short list, and then the other nominee got in there, Powell, but she's been proposed again, and I'm not sure at what point that's going to happen. I believe it will, and I believe that there will be a transitioning then. I think a lot of people think that is probably going to happen after Trump's second term, that hopefully in order to continue this process, President Trump needs to get reelected, and then the major restructuring would happen after that point. Obviously, between now and the election is too short of a time to deal with all of that, especially with this completely stalled economy. And that raises the question, which I guess I'll throw out to both of you, because I don't know the answer, is what does the economy look like between now and the election? Will President Trump actually be able to get this thing off the ground in order to secure himself a re-election?
Well, I think it's a hot air balloon, and it's had a hole in it, and if all he has to do is, he's got I don't know if he can patch the hole, but he can probably create more hot air. He seems to be good at that. Just kidding. No, I mean, he definitely knows how to, and you kind of alluded to this, Don. He knows how to work with a corporation that is in bankruptcy and that is bleeding money. So we do have that advantage with him being our president. So personally, I'm hopeful, and I just want to, because I'm a feeler, I'm kind of I guess I'm empathizing a little bit with people who might be listening to this who have not really considered some of these concepts or who have not studied the history of money. We just for years we used our paper currency, and then we started to use debit cards and credit cards, and a lot of people just don't give it a thought. So for anybody who's never given it a thought and they're hearing that this is going to change, I just want to let people know that what you mentioned about us going off the gold standard in the 70s, that I remember that very, very well. I remember there being fuel shortages, whether that was real or contrived, I'm not really certain, but I remember being told that we needed to keep our thermostats at 55 at night. I remember gasoline prices exploding. And again, and what I've said just now has terrified people even more. But what I really want to do is offer the perspective of history that there have been different monetary systems throughout history, and it is fundamental to how well people live, whether there's a sound money system or not. And one that I've always enjoyed reading about is the tally stick. And after the Roman Empire fell, there wasn't a common currency for people to use, and that was partly what what happened in the Dark Ages. There wasn't currency, so it was very difficult for people to invest. And again, the financial system underpins everything that happens with humanity. It's unfortunate, and maybe that won't go on forever. Maybe we can have a Star Trek economy someday where it's all just merit based, and we work because we take pleasure from it, and we're honorable people. We'll see how that turns out. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, the tally stick was introduced, and that was an objective monetary system standalone that permitted common people to access the financial system. And that worked very well in financing the Renaissance. So there have been these cycles throughout history. And as I'm bringing up the Roman Empire, I don't even want it to sound like we need to fall down all the way, like what happened in the Dark Ages. I don't believe that. I believe that we are in capable hands. And we have had a U.S. president who got rid of central bankers, that being Andrew Jackson, and he's something of a hero for President Trump. And Don, you probably have something to say about Andrew Jackson.
STP. Like President Trump. That's the MBTI. This is Ken again.
Yeah, so Jackson is a ISTP?
Yes, ESTP.
ESTP. Yeah, that makes sense. I read a biography of him, and that is how I would see him.
This is Enneagram.
I thought of Andrew Jackson as being a 1 as I read that, and so that is a kind of. Did you, Cindy, also get that vibe from him?
I haven't clearly. I didn't read that book, and the film biographies that I've seen about him, I didn't have a clear grasp of what. If he is a 1, I think you might have mentioned him being a 1 like our friend. But was there a reformer 1? There's a specific kind of a 1 that can be kind of a cowboy. Kind of a cowboy type.
Yeah.
So that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, we're kind of going down a tangent there, but it's an important one. I think the whole idea of restoring America's sound money is a battle that's been fought throughout history, and it's being fought again. And I did, as you were talking, Cindy, remember a film that we watched a while ago, and I put it in our show notes there in my area, the Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings, Volume 3, The Eye of the Phoenix, Secrets of the Dollar Bill. And the way that documentary, and there's a lot of great information in there about the people that were behind FDR and all of the Illuminati symbolism and all of that is basically underpinning the confidence game that has gone on for an amazingly long period of time with this dollar that isn't a dollar. The founders envisioned a dollar as being something completely different. It was a specific weight of silver, and now it no longer is. But the way that documentary ends, you see this dollar bill going across the world and it blanketing the world. And that has been the plan of the people that were the private owners of the Federal Reserve, which I believe has now become bankrupt, and not publicly, but it's been absorbed into the Treasury, and bankruptcy of the Federal Reserve is the way that I could see that would happen. So this plan of basically taking over the world with funny money has been torpedoed. It's not going to happen. And I think that is incredibly good news, that whatever future we have for humanity, it's going to be based on something real. Now, people say that the dollar is fiat money, and again, I'm saying no, that's not right. It's based on contracts of labor, and hopefully we don't transition into something along those lines. I don't believe we will. I believe there's going to be perhaps there's going to be commodities as well as contracts that are valued because of building out of infrastructure that is going to need to happen. There has to be a way to basically get the so-called free energy technology into the current economy. And I think that will happen based on the value of the contracts that are going to be necessary to do that work. So we'll see how it all shakes out. I do believe it's a hopeful future because we see that the ultimate confidence game has been ended. It's the people have pulled back the curtain and they see what's been happening, and they're not going to let it continue. That's a good thing. Ken, as I think about the future, I know you wanted to end on a optimistic note, and you've already been talking in our off-show planning about the possibility of doing a show on some of the technologies that are out there that are coming into the mainstream visibility, such as cold fusion and other things. And you have some thoughts on that you'd like to leave us with?
Sure. I think, I don't know who discovered that in our group. Cindy, maybe you did, or Zach. What's his last name? Zach from Google?
Zach Voorhees. Yeah, the X22.
Yeah, I guess there was did you discover that?
Well, yeah,
it
both
came
of us
up
together,
on
yeah.
Queue. Yeah, we did.
Yeah, she has a better memory for that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
It's an interesting concept. Certainly, we need a little time to catch up and see how it was tamped down, basically. But the problem with it back then was that it would have theoretically, and it just for the listener, the viewer, it basically was a way. Cold fusion is a way of unlocking the nuclear energy in matter. And I believe from versions that I've heard, you hear all sorts of things that may or may not be true, but that theoretically from a swimming pool size of amount of water, you could power an entire city for 10 years or something like that. So it's basically, it's not that outlandish really, because there is an incredible amount of energy locked in matter, was discovered by Einstein. And the only elements that were unlocked were the radioactive, because I think they had that free electron or something with that. But apparently in cold fusion you can unlock the molecular energy in a wider array of raw materials, almost unlimited. So that would be interesting, but it would have completely upset the oil. The oil being the basis of the currency. Every currency theoretically needs to have a commodity behind it, and it was gold. I think that's why I'm thinking we'll go back to the gold. But Don, what do you think? What impact do you think? Do you see that as an opportunity now that is the door open to that?
Yeah, I think it is now. I think that's exactly where we're at. It becomes an opportunity. And one of the things that Zach Voorhees said in that interview was that as he looked into, with his technically oriented mind, looked into the evidence that was being used to say no, cold fusion wasn't ready yet, it didn't make sense. And as he followed the rabbit trail, he found out that they were the real scientists still believed in it, still understood it, and what was happening was the media was being given cover stories to release to the public saying that this was a pipe dream, wasn't going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Well, as we know now, having pulled back the curtain a little bit, the real reason is that the petrodollar wasn't ready to die. So now that the petrodollar is dying, the news corporations are also dying because that's where their funding comes from. All the pharmaceuticals, that's hydrocarbon driven. That's all based in the same model. So all of that funding is being removed from the mainstream media that was actually positioning themselves to hold back cold fusion and other free energy technologies, and not completely free. That's kind of a misnomer, but you get the idea. There is the idea of mankind being controlled by a monopoly on energy sources is coming to a close. And I don't think there's anything more positive and uplifting than that to think about as we close. It's that we have a future which is going to be freed from monopolistic control, not only of the monetary system, but the energy systems that it interacts with as well. So I think that's great news for the upcoming days to ride through the turbulence.
Dear curious seekers and experts, thank you for joining us for this episode of PolyPsych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this time as we have. If you have, we ask that you please click like, subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on BitChute, follow us on Twitter for a great ride, and if you have a moment, visit our website. Again, thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay well and take care.